Hello, and welcome to this Rightful Lives podcast. I'm Julie Newcombe, and today I'm going to be talking to Dr Dawn Cavanagh, who is a Rightful Lives admin and also the founder of Stolen Lives Wales. We'll be discussing Dawn's recent research project, which looks at mothers' experiences of having a son or daughter with a learning disability or who is autistic in long-term secure detention. So Dawn, could you tell us how your research into mothers' experiences came about?
So in terms of how the research came about, Manchester Metropolitan University were carrying out an evaluation of something called the HOPES programme. So the HOPES programme is a human rights-based model that aims to reduce long-term segregation that's often experienced by people with a learning disability and or autism when they're detained in secure hospitals. It's a model and approach that's is funded by Merseycare NHS Foundation Trust. That's right. And basically, there was a lot of rich qualitative data that came from that study. And the HOPES team kind of were looking at that data and thinking, well, can we ask new questions of that data that could potentially generate new insight? And there were 6 mothers that had been interviewed as part of this study that had both a qualitative and a quantitative element and had many different aspects to it. And one of the questions that we thought, well, would it be useful to look at mothers' experiences of having a son or a daughter with a learning disability and or autism who's detained in a secure hospital long term? So that's basically, in a nutshell, what happened. And then I went and did that work. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Dawn. What did your findings reveal about mothers' experiences?
So there were 4 main themes that came from the findings, and they're all equally important. However, 2 of them came across really, really powerfully. One of them that came across really powerfully was about trauma, the mother's trauma. All the mothers said that before their children were even detained, that it'd been a real battle for them to get services and support, that they'd basically been fighting for years. Once their child had been detained, that separation was deeply traumatic, and the mothers described it as being akin to a bereavement. The mothers said that being separated from their child was awful, and how it impacted greatly on the mother-child relationship. A child relies on its mother hugely for psychological, for its well-being, emotional well-being, for its physical well-being. That relationship is so deep and symbiotic, isn't it? And mothers said how it was so difficult to keep in touch and keep in contact, even so hard on a telephone when your child is in distress, when they struggle to communicate anyway, when they may be incapacitated. They described how it was so hard in terms of visitor restrictions. Some mothers hadn't seen their child in years, and it was so hard to have a relationship with your child in these really restrictive, noisy settings with lack of privacy, and with a child that's so deeply distressed. Mothers described how their children were subjected to horrendous use of restrictive practices, such as seclusion, long-term segregation, physical restraint, mechanical restraint, and some of their sons and daughters had been in there since childhood. There were 2 cases of their children being in there since the age of 13 and having been detained longer than having been in longer than they'd been out, and having been in all through their adolescence and into adulthood, and having missed out on birthdays, missed out on anniversaries, hadn't seen their grandparents for years, had missed out on deaths of family members. There's a case where someone hadn't even seen their siblings, never met them. Absolutely tragic. And mothers, all the mothers said that they thought their children would die in there. Awful cases of abuse and neglect, descriptions of broken bones during restraint, mechanically restrained to the point where they couldn't go toilet anymore, where they couldn't, affected their mobility, sexual abuse, probably the most difficult findings I've ever had to deal with. And they talked about social isolation, the fact that when you've been through something like this, you cannot, you lose family, you lose friends. How on earth is anybody going to understand what you've been through? And they talked about how it was difficult to even tell their own parents because they were concerned about how that would devastate them. There was, the concern about stigma. And then there was this other really powerful theme, which was powerlessness and frustration. So all the mothers described coming across staff that were very inexperienced, inadequately trained, and or abusive. They described feeling excluded from decision-making and feeling really powerless. They described, I'll just check my notes here actually, because there's so much to say. They described not being listened to, being seen. There was a lot of parent blame. And I think another sort of big sort of sub-theme was around this kind of legal biases and discrimination. That when it came to things like mental health tribunals, they didn't know the rules of the game. Often the mothers would say, we didn't know any, when our children were first admitted, we didn't know any of the terminology. We didn't know what long-term segregation meant or anything. And we'd go to tribunals and we didn't know what we were doing. And there was a lot of evidence of testimonial injustice where their words didn't mean as much as the professionals' words. There was evidence of falsification of records and just simply not being believed. And even though, even if things did go to safeguarding or things did go to a ward did get closed, abuses would still occur. And what was really concerning is that mothers would say if we did express concerns or things, we would be threatened. We'd be told, you carry on like this and you're not going to get to see your son or daughter. And sometimes mothers had court injunctions put on them, and they would actually be silenced through the courts. So these were really, really awful findings. And that's just 2 of the themes. I could go on.
Thanks, Dawn. Some truly awful findings there. And, it feels as if, as you say, people are totally powerless. And when these dreadful things happen, there's nothing they can do about it. What do you think the findings of your research say about the human rights of people with learning disabilities and autistic people being detained long-term in secure hospitals?
I think it's really important to highlight that these findings don't just show them as individual trauma, but they also highlight the kind of legal and systemic factors, those broader legal and systemic factors that can cause harm. We're really looking at systemic trauma here. And it's really interesting because, we have the Human Rights Act. We have Articles 3 about prohibition of inhumane and degrading treatment in Articles 8 about the right to family life, Articles 5, the right to liberty and security. We have the UN CRPD, the UN CRC in terms of the rights of the child. English policy makes it clear, that hospitalisation, institutionalisation can cause harm. We have standards, we have statutory guidance, Cheney's law, for example, all of those things. But when it comes to it, nothing is actually changing on the ground. And I think a key thing for me from the mother's stories was the fact that their children were not seen as being human. They were never seen as human beings. And it's really hard to kind of enforce human rights law or this kind of or these things in policy if your children aren't even seen as being human beings in the first place. It makes abuse, it makes things far more acceptable anyway. So, yeah, in terms of that question around what does it say about human rights? Well, they don't have any when you're in there and when you're in that situation. They don't seem to have any, and neither do their families. So there is a complete disconnect between what we think the law is saying and policy and actually what's happening on the ground.